Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Observability Talks, the opening episode of our fifth season. And I'm your host, Dutan Horvitz. And here at Open Observability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So, as always, may the open source be with you. And it's exciting to start the fifth year of the show. And I'd like to thank our devoted followers and listeners for supporting us and for support and feedback. So if you haven't already, now's the time to hit the follow button and rate us on your favorite podcast app. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, Logs.io, the cloud-native observability platform. Logs.io takes the best-of-breed open source projects such as Prometheus, OpenSearch, Ioniega, and offers them as a unified observability platform built for scale. For those joining the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, feel free to share questions and comments on the chat. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. So for those who followed on the last episode, the one concluding the fourth season, we discussed the flux in open source with ever more projects, relicensing, and otherwise, as I call it, turning to the dark side. And a great episode with David Nailey. Check it out, highly recommended. And today, as we open the fifth season, I'd like to look at another project that recently relicensed off open source, Redis. And the new open source fork that started under the Linux Foundation, Valkey. So Valkey recently reached general availability, and it had just last week its first contributor summit. So lots of updates on this to hear today. And as I said, today we have my guest Kyle Davies, the developer advocate of Valkey, who works at AWS, and before that, long, rich experience at Redis, contributing to the project. So Kyle, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and actually, you're a returning guest to the show. Last time you were on the show, we discussed another open source project relicensing away from open source. Back then, it was Elasticsearch, and you were advocating for OpenSearch, the open source fork of Elasticsearch and Kibana. So I guess by now you're a specialist in forks of open source projects that went off open source, huh?
Yeah, I don't know how I get myself into this, but I'm always around when these things tend to happen. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm super excited to be talking about. It was a pleasure talking about OpenSearch with you, but I'm super excited to be back and talking about Valkey.
Yeah, so Valkey is the topic today, and as I mentioned very briefly, you actually have a very rich and founded background with Redis from the good old time. So maybe you can start by telling us a bit about your background with the Redis open source project.
Yeah, sure. My history with Redis goes back to I was trying to figure it out somewhere around 2012 or 13, I think, is when I really started using Redis back in the day. And I kind of, I had been building a bunch of stuff and I thought, I am running a small amount of data in, and at that time, MySQL, and I was looking at how much it was actually consuming just sitting idle with no data in it, just the amount of RAM. And I said, you know what? I need to be fast and I need it to, exist in memory. I don't really care about any type of persistence on it. My first thought was I'll just write my own in-memory database, and I quickly realized that was a dumb idea. And then I found this project called Redis that was kind of meeting all my needs for this. And so I started kind of like writing blog posts about it, using Node.js and Redis, and eventually people started following me for that. And then a company came to me and said, hey, we'd love to pay you for it. And I said, well, I like money, so I'll take your money. I thought people just wrote blog posts for free. And that company was Redis Labs. And that eventually became the head of developer advocacy at Redis Labs. And so I was heavily involved in the Redis community for several years.
Redis Labs, just for the audience who doesn't know, that's the commercial company behind the Redis project, and the one who recently relicensed it.
Yeah, and now they're called Redis Limited. It's our Redis Inc. I'm not sure, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, they use different parts of it. They're just called Redis now. So I work for them as the head of developer advocacy. You saw me in probably every conference and on stage talking about everything new in it for several years. And then I joined AWS, and then I joined a little thing called Open Distro for Elasticsearch, which eventually became OpenSearch, and worked on that for a while. Did some other things at AWS and open source. And then when this Valkey thing happened, like, it was just the right timing, and I was kind of brought in in for that. So yeah, I mean, I've been around for a long time in this community, so it's kind of like a return to form for me. I'm really excited to be back. And I noticed at the contributor summit, like I was just sitting there and like it was the riding the bike moment. Like all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, okay, I'm back in this. I know how to take the corners at speed. I know how to do all these things. So it's really cool to kind of be back, right? And I'm really excited about the kind of new direction that Valkey is taking the project.
Yeah, so essentially, we talked a bit about that on the last episode. But for those who haven't heard, and again, highly recommend to listen in on the episode with David Nailey last episode. But can you give us the brief sneak about what happened, and also maybe with your perspective, knowing the community inside and out?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing. I'll kind of start a little bit further back. Redis was created by a guy named Salvatore Sanfilippo. He was a developer out of Sicily, and he's working for various organizations. He wasn't working for Redis, the company that just changed its license. He's working for, I can't remember the exact company at the time. He went through several different companies, Pivotal and a few other ones. But they let him kind of open source the project, and eventually Redis Labs Limited, whatever it is, hired him, and then they changed their name. They were like Garantia Data at some point originally, and then they became Redis Labs at that point. Yeah. So Redis, Salvatore and I both worked at Redis for a long time. He left in 2020. I think that they offered him an opportunity to kind of like just live on the beach and not have to worry about things. I know he wrote a pretty interesting sci-fi book that a friend of mine had translated from the Italian into English. It's about AI. It's actually worth a read. But anyway, he left, and what happened was they left Redis in this kind of community governance, but that's what they called it. Or it basically had 2 engineers from Redis, a community manager from Redis, Madeline Olson from AWS, and Zhao Zhao from Alibaba. And those are the people who were making the technical decisions on that. And then that was back in 2020, and that went on for several years. And then back in, I believe it was the end of March, the months are kind of blurring together.
Yeah, March. When they announced.
I couldn't remember if it was April or March. Basically, they said, hey, guess what? We're dissolving that kind of community governance, and we're changing the license from BSD 3 clause, which it had been since the beginning, to RSAL v2 and SSPL. There's 2 different versions of those. Sometimes I get them backwards, but RSAL,
both of them are non-open source.
That's right.
They are source available for those who know this term, but definitely not open source licenses. Yeah,
and one is, RSAL is a proprietary license. Redis is sort of source available. It's their own license. No other project uses it. And SSPL is used by a few different projects. Yeah. But it's been recognized, and even in the blog post where they made this announcement, they said it's not open source, right? So once they said that it wasn't open source, Madeline Olson from AWS and Zhao Zhao and several other contributors from that were already working on Redis decided to create kind of a new version of this, kind of continuing from the last open source version of Redis, and it's initially called Placeholder KV. Basically from there, that obviously wasn't a permanent name. It moved to be Valkey, and at the same time, it became a Linux Foundation project. So right now we have a technical steering committee that's got people from AWS, it's got people from Alibaba, so the 2 people that carried over. Then it's got somebody from Ericsson, it's got somebody from Huawei, Tencent, and Google. So 6 people on it, and some very big and well-known names there. And they're the people who make the technical choices in Valkey now. So, and it's forked from the 7.2.4, and our first GA version was 7.2.5. But it's the same source code that you know and love, but with different names here and there. It's fully compatible. So you have a workload that's running Redis 7.2.4. It's like a patch version upgrade. Something you shouldn't really worry that much about to go to Valkey. So that's the story as we are right now. We got some stuff happening in the future.
We'll talk really about the dynamics is fascinating. First of all, because my statement, and it's written, so you can hold me true for that even in the future. But I think shortly after that, well, when Redis relicensed, essentially, there are a few forks popping up with the same idea to carry over, whether forks or alternatives that were Redis compatible. Let's broaden it. So anyway, several paths to keep the notion of Redis at least out in the open source. And I've seen all of them. I follow them. I cover them. For those who follow me, saw the different forks and or initiatives. But then when I saw Valkey, I really, my feeling was, and that's what I posted back then. I said that I think this is the strong candidate. And I seeing, well, as you know, I've seen a few forks both with you and others, but in the dynamics of open source in general, the let's say health indicators and the things that you're looking for, first is what you said, is that the fact that the initiators of that are the core maintainers of the original project. Like, these are people who know it inside and out. These were the people that maintained it to the bits and bytes just a minute ago under the Redis one. So this is obviously a very clear-cut advantage. There's no like outsiders trying to now very quickly learn things in order to understand. And it's an impressive code base, obviously. Secondly, what you said, the fact that it's under the Linux Foundation. You and I went through this episode with OpenSearch and others, where we wanted them in the foundation, and it wasn't from the get-go, and some of them are still not there yet, and the discussion is still ongoing. Here, it was from the get-go. This needs to be under the governance of an open source foundation, Linux Foundation being a very good housing for that. So definitely, and I know I'm a CNCF ambassador, so I'm biased, but still, I think it's a wise move. And thirdly, I think you said very nicely, it's who backs it. When you have backing like you folks in AWS and Google and Oracle and Ericsson and all the Huawei and all the big names that you mentioned, and I saw a second wave joining afterwards, which was very nice to see also more, and the diversity there is something that gives a lot of reassurance. Actually, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and again, I know that you come from the Valkey side, but when you look at other contenders, forks, I think the Microsoft one is not exactly a fork, but it's Redis compatible. It's a rewrite or something. How do you see Valkey in this multitude of options there?
It's interesting because like some of these that were kind of brought up as like the alternatives that have existed for a long time, right? So if we start looking at them, some people say, well, there's KeyDB, and KeyDB has existed for years. It's backed by Snapchat, and it came from a technical difference with the Redis project, and they decided to do their own thing and kind of rewrite a bunch of it in C++, and it's a fine project, right? But ultimately, and I think that, and I'll go over these individually, they're not the same thing very often, and I'll go over, there's a couple different vectors to look at. Like, if you take a look at what happened with KeyDB, it really wasn't a drop-in replacement. It was very similar, but you probably, if you were just to replace the binaries, for example, on your existing node topology, you'd have a bad day, right? Because it's just it takes advantage of the CPU in a different way, and you probably provision different things. So it was different, and it was been under different leadership for a while. It was, I think, the last version it maintained, compatibility with was version 6. And then you looked at Microsoft had the Garnet project, which was rewritten in .NET. And of course, if you try to take Valkey's written in C, just straight C, and you try to replace a .NET application with it, you're going to have a very bad time. I mean, they're very, very different. You look at, there's some other source available options, Dragonfly DB, it's probably a fine project, but it's not really that much different than when you start thinking about it. And then, one that's compared most similar and actually was kind of came out at the same time as Redict. Redict was a LGPL 3.0 license project, a derivative of Redis, and it came out as a reaction to the license change. And there's a few different things there. I mean, LGPL is a fine license, but some people have restrictions against that type of copyleft license in a variety of contexts. So that's one thing you have to take care of. And the other, and I think most important thing, is that the people who were behind that, smart people, but they had not really been actively involved with the Redis project, as intimately, as you noted, as the people who are involved with Valkey. And so what I really think about it is, and I mentioned this before, the community governance was really like, 5 people, and one of those was a community manager. So 2 engineers and 2 engineers. And you really think about that, that's where the split occurred, right? Yeah. So 2 engineers went off to, stayed doing the Redis side, doing whatever they're going to do over there. And 2 engineers went to Valkey, and then we brought in contributors. And all the people who were involved on the technical steering committee are not new to the code base. They were existing contributors to Redis prior to 7.2.4. So really, it's kind of like we just took the existing kind of non-Redis limited contributor base and continued doing what we're going to do anyway. So that allowed for a really quick way to move forward on the project itself, and a quick way for the people to come up with a really good roadmap going forward. We know what we're going to do in Valkey. I'm not sure if Riddick or Garnet or any of these other folks, if they have, the same idea and, project trajectory as Valkey does. And I think that comes from just the history of being previously involved with the project.
Yeah, and so I think this is a very important point, and obviously we'll touch about the roadmap in this show in a few minutes. And also, and you mentioned that briefly, but I think it's a very strong point to mention, this drop-in replacement. So if you are a Redis user, it's very easy to just drop and replace with Valkey, especially in this current release. And so I think this is definitely a strong point for Valkey in this regard.
Yeah, and that's been something that's been really clear from people who have been involved with the project. We want to make sure this is something we're not going to ruin anybody's day, and great lengths have been gone to. Just as an example, even like the server for Redis was Redis-server, and the CLI was Redis-CLI. Yeah. We included symbolic links when you install it, so we want you to use Valkey-server or Valkey-CLI, but if you accidentally type Redis-CLI, you'll still get us, right? It will still work, right? These are the sort of things that just make your life a little bit easier. But it goes beyond that.
The origin.
Well, you know what? Gosh, it's hard. And there we were at the Contributor Summit, and even people who talk about it a lot, one person said, you mentioned, you should have said Valkey 23 times, but instead you said Redis 23 times. And that's part of when you make these switches, especially if you were involved for many, many years, which this individual was, it's hard to make those context switches, so it makes it easy. But from a technical standpoint, beyond that, it's the same data file format. You can take, a Valkey node and a Redis node, and they can run in the same cluster. Like they can be in a heterogeneous cluster. So you can do all the sorts of things like that. The data files are the same. The API is certainly the same. All that stuff is the same. So 7.2.4 and 7.2.5 do kind of follow that semantic versioning thing, that we didn't break anything for you. You shouldn't have to worry about a patch release. So, it is functionally a search and replace. If they had gone in and replaced, Redis with foobar, it would have had the same effect, right? We just went in and changed those kind of internal and external file names, that sort of thing. But the project itself is moving forward where there will be more substantial changes, but still kind of maintaining some of the spirit of that. I don't think there's any appetite for people to make changes that will, come in and you expect something to happen one way and it does something entirely different or breaks random things like that. That's something that there's no appetite for.
Nice. I have a question. Putting your hat as a Redis community member, and taking aside your role within as leading the community, what did it feel like for a Redis long-standing user, not the maintainer even or a contributor, when this thing happened. Can you tell us the day in the life of the common user of Redis when all this happened, and how the community responded from the chatter that you saw on the different mediums and read the subreddits and whatnot, where the chatter is going on?
Yeah, and I think that was my kind of initial reaction, because when this happened, I wasn't involved with, Redis or Valkey at the time, but I was pretty upset. I was scrolling through Mastodon actually and saw that somebody had posted about it, and I took the screenshot of, the license change in the GitHub repo, and it was like license change like 4 minutes ago. I was pretty quick on the draw, and I was pretty upset, and honestly, because I was upset because I put a lot of effort into, being part of the community. I put a lot of effort into encouraging people to contribute. I put a lot of effort into writing lots of things. I wrote books about it. I wouldn't have necessarily done that. I wouldn't probably started even down that line if it'd been a closed source project, or not a non-open source project, probably would be more accurate in this term. And so I felt pretty, upset about that. That's something that, I think most people felt, and the reaction on that post, I think there was 500 or 600, retweets or retweets or whatever it is on Mastodon. It was, what's that? Boosts.
Boost.
Yeah, boosts. I think toot was the original term, but that was a little bit, had double meanings that people didn't really like. Anyway, so yeah, I think that I saw that reaction. I saw people just being like, yeah, this is not, it's not what I signed up for when I joined the community, when I thought about it as a place that I wanted to spend my time, or even something, that you just relied on as part of your infrastructure in your application, because then all of a sudden you might not be in compliance with your company's policies going forward. It's a big headache to just one day wake up and realize something that you had relied on might not have the same future that it did the day before. Like that's yeah, I mean, it's kind of awful. It's like going out to your car or something and realize someone stole the wheel off of it. It's not the same thing anymore. So
I like this metaphor, like this sense of it's more than rational. It's like it hurts you in the guts that you
it does.
like betrayal of trust or something like that. So I really saw that as well. But
it feels like somebody took something from you. I mean, that is the probably easiest way to say it. And just, you had something and you were relying on it, and suddenly the next day you no longer can do that. That doesn't feel great.
And when the fork came out, because I remember, again, going back to the forking of Elasticsearch and the origins of OpenSearch, that people said, okay, they will grant, they will complain, but then they will stick around with Elasticsearch. Or this was some of the chat that we had internally, or like in the community, because it's so much to it's a burden to move, and people complain, but they will not do anything about that. And I get a different sense here with Redis, but I'm again curious to get your sense, because you live and breathe the community. When the fork, or even forks, even before Valkey, just the fact that there is going to be an alternative, and once the alternative presented itself, what did you see, like in the broader sense? Obviously, your closer circle are ones that are very passionate and moved, but when you try to broaden the discussion, did you hear different voices, or do you see it very much towards, hey, we're going to push for that, and we're going to move for that once it's available?
Yeah, I think there's a couple differences, between something like OpenSearch and something like Valkey, right? And I think the big difference is just how you integrate it into your software. When I think about OpenSearch, you use like various types of, log shippers or collectors or something like that, and it's usually external to your application. You built an application that emits logs, and those logs are then scooped up by some other process and then put into a search engine. So it's a little bit less kind of intimately related to your code. For a lot of applications using Redis and soon Valkey, this was something that you wrote into your code itself, and oftentimes it's one of the biggest integration points that you make, because if you're caching something, that caching may occur even more than hits to your database, right? Just by nature of what it is. And so this is something that became part of your code, right? Like you wrote a lot of this stuff. And so when I started thinking about what's the difference between the two, I really see that that kind of really close integration that people had with Redis meant a couple things. One, they were very familiar with it, right? Like this is something that they had written a lot of code that relied on it, wrote a lot of calls to Redis directly into various functions in their software. And two, so that made it hard to change, right? And two, when you start thinking about changing that, you don't have the option to go to something else. Like I think for a lot of people, when you're talking about maybe logging or some, doing log search or something like that, there's options out there. You're going to look at different things and you're going to maybe replace one for the other, figure out what's the best deal for you. And that sort of thing. It feels much more interchangeable. With something like Redis, it didn't feel that way. So they said, I need to get a replacement for this now. Like I need to jump in and figure out what's next because I have a lot of my own code that relies on this. And so I think that was a technical point of that decision. I think too, one of the things that people really see about something like a cache that Redis is in Valkey is more than a cache in many ways. It's the sort of things that make the application go from acceptable to really great. And so that becomes part of the strategy that you make really good software with. So when that's changed, you're risking the thing that makes your software great. So I think that also really added to people's urgency to see this and figure out what can I replace it with, how soon can I get it in, and what is this going to do to my software? Am I going to need to make thousands of lines of code changes? How do I even do that? That's a real big challenge, especially if you haven't planned for it. Like you're not going to deliver everything if you have to make thousands of lines of code changes on a random Tuesday. Like that's a bad day.
That's for sure. And anyway, I think it also depends. Like if you look at the Python community, for example, and like in some communities, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you saw the Redis at the time becoming very, very foundational to the culture and the way the frameworks in which this programming language has been done. Have you seen the difference between like sub communities within the developer community?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, when you look at things like the Rails community, and this is actually a point where Redis originally grew out of, was this idea that,
Yeah, Ruby actually. I said Python actually. Ruby one.
Well, in Python too. There's certainly ones there, but like Ruby, for example, Ruby on Rails uses kind of by default Redis, right? And so if there's a near one-to-one correlation of people who do that, and it's not even something that you maybe even knew a whole lot about, but it was part of your kind of foundation and part of the things that you built everything else on. And with in the Python community, things like Django rely on Redis. So for all those communities, like we want to make sure that this is out there. So you can't trying to remove something from one of these frameworks is impossible, right? If you built your entire thing on it, it's a very important part of it. So I think that for a lot of folks, when they built these big applications around having this there either directly making calls to Redis and now Valkey, or indirectly through a framework, it means that these things are things that you're going to have to think a lot about, and you need to have the change. And for example, if you're a Ruby developer, Ruby on Rails developer, the idea of making changes to the framework is something that's kind of antithetical to the entire idea of using a framework.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And I'm curious to hear, like that was, as we said, March was the announcement of the relicensing, and by April, which is less than a month, you announced the general availability, like GA version, and you were already within the Linux Foundation with all the red tape and paperwork involved in that. How the heck did you do that fast?
Not enough sleep. Secret. Not enough sleep. Don't sleep, and then this happens pretty easily. There's a couple things that went on for this. I think this kind of goes into what makes this kind of a unicorn situation. I don't know if this could be replicated in some ways. I think just having the existing contributors there that were working on Valkey and understood the constraints of moving Redis to a new name as Valkey. That was important from getting the release out, right? I will say that the Redis code base that Valkey came from is actually relatively constrained. It kind of by manifesto is not huge. It's fairly constrained, and so the just volumes of code. I think if I don't know the exact numbers, but if you're to look at the transition point, the Elasticsearch to OpenSearch versus Redis to Valkey, the lines of code would be much higher on the OpenSearch side. So that's just a part of it, and part of that's Java versus C, and one's more verbose and not. But so there's that part of it. That was helpful that we had both existing contributors and a relatively small code base in comparison to what it could have been. And then from the perspective of getting all the administrative things in line, right? Like, how did you move to a foundation so quickly? I think that's mainly where the people not sleeping came in. I know that for myself, I got involved pretty early, and Dave Nally had on previously. He was during some of this, he was traveling and in Europe at the time. I think he was at KubeCon, and he was responding to me in my evening hours in North America. And I started doing the math, and I'm like, this man's not sleeping. So he was pulling double duty on a lot of that. The other thing too, just from a standpoint of like how it was really done, I think a lot of this was like, let the engineers lead this, right? Like, they know what they're doing on a lot of this stuff. We had this idea that, it was going to be good to make sure that we had this, right? Like, the existing situation was untenable. So something had to be done. So it's better sooner than later, and get out of the way where we can, defer decisions if we have to. And then that's just kind of how it happened, right? I am so amazed that it happened so quickly. And then in contrast, looking at the OpenSearch days, and to kind of reveal some stuff behind this, because a lot of people that were doing this weren't even there. There was one person who was an Elasticsearch previous employee that kind of knew the full code base, and he was doing it mostly by himself, right? Just the whole switching of things over. That took an enormous amount of time. And the other thing that I will say that is quite interesting is that during that time period where we were making a lot of the changeovers, I think we had anticipated that those technical steering committee members would be doing most of those changes. But what was interesting was they enabled other people to do it. I started looking at the GitHub contribution graph and realized that a lot of these changes were not being done by the technical steering committee. They're being done by the community. Just people that were interested in it and maybe had a vested interest, I don't know. But they were people that, were gladly putting in hundreds and hundreds of code contributions to make that switch. I mean, it was pretty straightforward, change instances of Redis to Valkey in these particular ways. And we had one person who was an individual from, I believe it was from Vietnam, that was the top contributor during that time period. And he kind of just dove into it. No one asked him to do it. He wasn't doing anything like that. It was one of those kind of beautiful open source moments where you presented a problem, you gave them a way to make the changes for themselves, and they followed through on it, and did a lot of really important work. So it was a community effort. It was also an organizational effort as well to get it all done.
Oh, that's amazing. And these stories are, as you said, these are the open source moments. So I really love these stories. And jumping into today, as I said, just a few days ago, we're recording this Monday, and just Thursday, Friday last week, a few days ago, you had the first contributor summit of Valkey in Seattle. So curious to hear what's the latest on the project, and maybe the feeling of the community now these days post the GA and looking into 8.0 and past that. Give us the highlights.
Yeah, I mean, I got back from this on Saturday morning, so I it was a pretty fresh thing. It was really interesting though. When I look at what happened there, I think it was really necessary for us to have a contributor summit. As you can imagine, I kind of mentioned off all the TSC members, and some are in Seattle, Some are in Sweden, some are in China, some are in Toronto, all over the world, right? And to bring them together was really necessary for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, these are people who are going to be working together for what we believe to be a very long time. And so just kind of getting that trust, many of them had never met before, right? They had interacted on GitHub or whatever, but knowing their personalities is really important, and building that trust amongst each other is really important. And then the contributors as well, the TSC could seem, like this kind of disembodied decision-making group, but when you really broke it down into Madeline and Victor and, Ping, it makes a lot more sense to know who these people are, right? And just kind of being able to make that connection. But I think one of the more valuable parts of the Contributor Summit was really hearing what all the other organizations wanted to do and kind of give to the project. Some of this stuff I don't necessarily want to break the news on a stream. It's not my news to tell always. So, one of the things I can tell you is on our GitHub, which is Valkey-IO, that's our GitHub organization, almost everything we discussed is going to be turned into an issue. And so a lot of the stuff will be public there before anywhere else. But just looking at all the organizations that want to help out, I think one of the things that we saw a lot of was the previous project before Valkey, which we don't need to talk about it anymore. I think we know which one we're talking about. Maybe it did not run as much openly as Valkey's going to. So the idea that Valkey is out there and people can contribute to it means that a lot more organizations are interested in, contributing to it because they feel like they have a voice and it's not going to be wasted effort. The classic problem with open source is, yes, it's possible to make a contribution, but it's also possible that someone could just, who's on a steering committee, could just be like, this is not what I want, close the PR. And what this allowed us to do is kind of talk through a number of these issues, get some more feedback on the different pieces that they want to contribute. And then when that PR comes in, I think people will be primed and ready to go on this. So, it was really gratifying to see we had some hardware manufacturers there, which I thought was super interesting, who wanted to be like, here's a bunch of hardware for you to test on. We'll teach you how to best utilize our processors, and we'll review things and make sure that it performs as best as possible. And, software like Valkey is really important for a lot of CPU manufacturers because some of the highest end, instances and on-prem devices will be running Valkey. So they are incentivized to make sure it runs great. And then we had, various different pieces from, the Linux packaging community, which has been really opening for us. So they've been, talking about like, how are we packaging it for various different distributions. I got some news on that I can talk about a little bit later, but just seeing like, it's way more than just saying, yeah, it's available, that people want to embrace it. And I think from a Linux distribution standpoint, it's really interesting because they can't really package Redis going forward, right? It would be a violation of their values and potentially of their terms and policies to have Redis still in their registry. So we've seen a lot of people moving in that direction. Super interesting there. And, otherwise, I think what we're seeing a lot of is just organizations coming out of the woodwork to support Valkey and in both code and non-code ways. Like, I went through, and part of my job is to make sure that people know about Valkey, of course. But just hearing all the other organizations saying, yeah, I want to make sure that, we can support you at an event. I want to make sure that you come and present at our events, and just everybody, willing to do this. I will say I ordered 10,000 stickers, and I think most of them are gone, Valkey stickers. So I think you'll be seeing a lot of those sorts of things as we move forward. Just those small amounts of things are really gratifying to see in the community. And it just shows that there's this kind of industry-wide momentum behind Valkey as a project and the software that's there is bound to have a really great future. I can talk more about Valkey 8 and what's happening with that, but I think just this kind of environment which it's growing out of is really interesting to see.
Yeah, so just to make sure, because you mentioned the people who initiated it back in the fork, the two that were originally, but now there are, I think, around 6. So do you want to say at present who's behind, who's the leadership, who are the maintainers, a bit just for
Yeah.
people to get familiar with how the project is being run today?
Yeah, sure. I let me see if I can name all of their names and affiliations off correctly. Madeline Olson from AWS, which has been around the project for a number of years. Then we have Zhao Zhao from Alibaba. His both the same name, so Zhao and Zhao. We have Ping Xia, I think is the correct pronunciation of his last name, from Google. We have Wen, and his last name's escaping me, from Huawei. And we have Ben from Tencent. And let's see here. Who am I leaving out? Oh, Victor Soderquist from Ericsson. So I think that's everybody. Yeah, that's the TSC.
It shows really as I said, the diversity and I think in that respect, and I hold a lot of respect to Salvatore and the BDFL style running Reddit very successfully for many years.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do see also the value in maybe distributing it and making sure that there is diversity within the leadership and also in terms of the governance. So we said it used to be, as I said, the sort of BDFL, benevolent dictatorship for life. For those who don't know for the acronym, but what's the governance, the way that you see the governance going forward now in the Valkey project?
Yeah, so the TSC is kind of the main kind of governing body that we have for the entire project. So technical steering committee, and the technical steering committee intentionally kind of keeps it lean. It's kind of this minimal viable governance situation. We have mechanisms set up to create things like GitHub repos and assign maintainers to those. And so that becomes kind of the atomic area of the governance. And we're trying to keep it minimal and trying to keep it to a way to related to individuals, not to organizations, right? Like I said, the affiliations to all the TSC members, but one important point to know is Madeline holds that membership, not AWS, right? And Ping holds that membership, not Google. So let's just say that I started a company called Cow Corp and I offer an obscene amount of money to all the TSC members. In theory, I do not think this would happen, or it would happen and there would be some actions otherwise. They could all be employed by one company, but there are some backstops there in that TSC members can add other TSC members and remove other ones as well. So what that does is it keeps it from being, dominated by organizations that feel like that they have a technical pet project they want, right? And so when you have that sort of framework, it works successfully for a number of projects, but it does kind of sometimes go against this purely technical decision making. And I think that's where Valkey wants to be at the moment, right? Things could change in the future, but I think that the key idea here is to make it about the technical choices, engineers making technical choices. So anybody can come in and say, can the TSC look at this idea that I want? And the TSC will evaluate that. It doesn't go in saying, oh, well, this is an AWS feature, so AWS is going to get something like that. That's not how the project is set up, right? Yeah. It's set up to be evaluated on the merits of the contributions and the merits of the requests that are there.
That sounds good, and it sounds like it's set up for a real community project. And I want to jump in again to present, and again, big congrats for reaching the GA, the first GA for Valkey. So let us know, the ones who are not in the details, what is the GA about?
Yeah, so our current GA release is 7.2.5, and that was released in April and late April. And that, like I said before, is kind of a very minimal version that is no changes. I think there's maybe one change that was kind of already approved in the Redis repo by one of the contributors that we did add in, but it resulted in no, surface area changes. So that's what that's really for. Is for people who are in Redis right now, 7.2.4, to have a place to jump to 7.2.5 Valkey. And then coming up next will be our first major release, which will be Valkey 8.0. And that's coming out later this summer. At least that's the kind of timeline on it. It could stretch into maybe early fall. We'll have a couple of release candidates out for sure this summer. And most of that's already locked in. But that has a lot of great features. But the interesting thing is, when you look at it from a purely semantic versioning standpoint, there isn't a lot of breaking changes. In fact, there's not really any breaking changes. So it kind of does, seem a little weird that we're making it a major version. But I think from the idea of 7.2.4 to 7.2.5, that being a patch release, that's where that kind of semantic version comes in. And everything we're looking at in Valkey 8, including, I think one of the big things is maybe changing how IO threading will work. I've talked a little bit about this before when I talked about, dropping in one versus the other. I think that's the thing that comes closest to maybe a breaking change for people. There's no API changes, but maybe you would want to adjust perhaps maybe how your infrastructure is, deployed and that sort of thing, because you might be able to take better advantage of your existing CPUs. So that's really important. And for those who don't know how Valkey works and Redis before it, it uses a single-threaded event loop and runs through things very quickly. There's no contention and that sort of thing. And over the years, a few things have made it mostly single-threaded versus completely single-threaded. And I think we're at a point now where we have a couple different changes in how the silicon works on a CPU. Things like speculative execution and all these things that we can actually now take advantage of more of the transistors on the chip. So we're able to maybe write code that will work a little bit better and take advantage of some of the IO threading and not introduce challenges to having non-blocking code in that. So I think that's the biggest improvement you'll see. And then we look at it, there's a lot of things that are things that make things better, things that provide more insight. So when you cluster Valkey, you have to migrate the slots where your keys live, and there's some reliability and stability improvements with that. And we're really careful to look at this. In fact, there was about a 10-minute discussion on how an extra 7 bits would or would not be used, which that kind of goes to show you the type of people who are involved with developing Valkey. They care about 7 bits, not bytes, 7 bits. And just how we can make sure we could take advantage of it without introducing a breaking change for anybody in some edge case scenario. We want to make sure that even when you're going to Valkey 8, you still have a pathway.
And
with
that's
we're not
a mission. This is the principle that you're going to keep as part of the Valkey nature, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, and traditionally Valkey has been and Redis before it has been very, very conservative about not breaking people. And I think that most databases have kind of a similar idea that you shouldn't make breaking changes just because. And I think that's going to carry forward. There's some challenges to that, of course. We have some old terminology we want to get rid of. And that's challenging to get rid of when you have that same idea, because people can take dependencies on challenging terminology. But by and large, and some of the documents that kind of define what our theory and philosophy is behind all this have yet to be made public. But I think the emerging consensus is, we anticipate not really ever breaking people in ways that your application is integrated, right? So things that may eventually be, breaking changes, which none of these are planned as of today. So I want to be clear about that. But maybe your log line format will change. Maybe these things will change. Maybe how you deploy Valkey could change. So those sorts of things we see. Yes, if you're just completely without any evaluation, moving to different versions of software, that's not an expectation, but your expectation is the software that will communicate with that is more or less left intact. So yeah, I mean, I think that if I'm like, kind of like scrolling through on the screen next to me, like all the different changes, some of these things are, performance improvements in very specific areas, how we're dynamically, allocating memory in certain ways, just different parts on that. One of the things I've been looking at, and, the discussions on this are really interesting. Like, how would we change things in the future? Some of these things are not gone through yet, but, it was discussed. Right now, Valkey still supports 32-bit processors, and we're in 2024. Those aren't really used in any production environment and haven't been for many years. And so there's a big discussion right now. This is not planned, but there's a big discussion. Like, how can we say, you should use a 64-bit processor to run Valkey thoughtfully? How do we do this where people will not be surprised because they have some, creaky old server in a closet that's running this? How do we do this in a way that makes sense for people? And what are our gains in it, right? Right now the theoretical thought is, if we remove 32-bit, we may get some gains in 64-bit because we're making some, some trade-offs there. But we want to be sure, right? Like, this sort of like really thoughtful, user-oriented decision-making is something that we really value in the project. So I think it permeates a lot of different layers there.
Nice. And again, I think that that the compatibility is important. You didn't touch RESP, but obviously RESP is also something that will be important. So you're going to keep, I assume, the spec there.
The serialization protocol. Yeah, so RESP, the serialization protocol, we're just calling it RESP now. It's not an acronym for anything for obvious reasons. So there's two versions of that right now. There's version 2. Version 1, it didn't exist for many, many years. 2 is kind of what it defaults to, and 3 is the next version up from that. And 3 isn't even that well utilized to this day, but it's been around for 5 years, I think, 6 years. So if we were to make changes, we could make changes at that boundary. If there was a theoretical, yet again, hasn't been discussed, RESP 4, when you make that handshake, of course, then you have no background that you have to worry about as far as sending something that would change. You have a natural kind of boundary there. So yeah, but RESP 2 is certainly how your process starts, and you can go into RESP 3, but it all works the same. It'll be byte for byte the same for your application today.
Nice. Again, well, some of the exciting news that we've heard very, very recently were also on the adopter side and the Linux distros and so on. Can you share with us a bit about where Valkey is being adopted in production cases, in open source projects, maybe also in commercial products?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting to see what this is going through, and we talked a little bit about Linux distros, but they have had a real quick pickup on this for a couple reasons. One, a lot of these Linux distros are themselves users of Redis, so they needed a way to get off of Redis because they have a mandate to be all open source. But more importantly, packaging something that it's a non-open source, binary is something they don't really want to be in the business of doing. So we've seen a number of different distros do a couple things. Availability is very wide at this point. Almost any Linux distro will already have Valkey at this point. But a number of distros have gone even further. So Fedora 41, which is due out in October, will now basically entirely replace Redis with Valkey. So you say you want to have that. There's a transition package, a compatibility package that will help you transition. But if you ask for Redis, you will get Valkey in Fedora 41. And then you also see a similar motion in, not exactly the same, but similar in Alpine Linux in their 3.10. And, we'll see other distros, those two distros seem to be kind of the first to jump into these different pieces. So I'll readily expect things like, RHEL and other ones to move forward in a similar motion in the future. That may take some time. They have different release cycles. We were talking at the contributor summit about like how this is going to work for Ubuntu, which will be a massive number of Linux users. So just an absolute enormous number of Linux distributions moving over, and it's near universal at this point. The as far as user stories of people converting, those are still coming in. We've heard lots of different people that from people who have just been like, I recall a story of somebody running I think a PeerTube instance, so another Fediverse thing, and they were like, "Here's how you transition: change this line in the YAML file from Redis to Valkey." Done, right? Like they transitioned their entire instance over with one line change because that's the big differences here. And I think what we'll see very soon, and it's a little bit premature to talk about this, but we'll start seeing managed service providers switch over. So if you really start thinking about the managed service provider, surface area on that, once we start seeing some of the big clouds move over, or even the smaller providers, that's going to be the industry. We're kind of moving very quickly towards a Valkey future.
That's amazing. And in the Ruby community that you mentioned before, do you hear discussion about aligning there the framework?
I think that's something that's kind of an ongoing conversation. I'd love to kind of get more involved in some of those conversations. I'm not a Rubyist myself, but I think that all those different pieces are going to be things that we're going to have to make discussions on. We'll see about those, but if I had to guess, yeah, they'll start transitioning over. But I don't know at this point as far as Ruby is concerned. It's
Nice.
a little bit of a crystal ball.
No, it's fine. And just curious now, looking into your employer, AWS, it was very exciting to see AWS standing behind it and backing this project. Any plans specifically for AWS around that? What kinds of involvement or anything with that regard?
Yeah, and I'll be clear, my role here at AWS is actually firewalled to a great degree from the Elastic Cache team, which is their delivered Redis version. I don't work on that team, and I don't really have a whole lot of... I intentionally stay out of meetings. They talk about their plans because I don't need to know. And also, I will sometimes... They brought me in to say, how would open source Valkey think about us doing this, and just as a person to say no to things. And that's the extent of my involvement. But I can say, early on, I helped draft a blog post, and it's something you can find on the AWS open source blog about the intentions of Elasticache moving over. As far as actual timing on that, I don't really have a good idea on it. But I know that's their intention, is to kind of have it as an engine in that. And I think, I don't want to speak for other people who aren't my employer, but certainly they have told me very similar things. So I think that it's pretty evident by people who's involved, what this is all going to look like.
Yeah, so really exciting. We're about to be on time. So I wanted to thank you so much. And joining me also in this very special episode, opening the fifth season of 5 year, fifth year. Could you imagine that? I think you're on the first year or second, so you've been seeing that through.
We got to do it more
years.
often.
And it's an auspicious time because it's also the 10th. This time is also the 10th, the decade, 10th anniversary of Kubernetes, or as we in the CNCF call it, Kubertenis. So lots of festivities all around the world there with the 10th anniversary, the decade. And by the way, it's a good opportunity to invite our listeners to check out the episode that I had with Kelsey Hightower, which was summarizing the year, but also looking back to the decade that passed and to the decade, what he foresees for the decade to come. I'll share that on the note. So really a good timing, and thank you so much for helping me opening up the season with a very exciting new project in the open source sphere, a very important one for many of us.
My pleasure.
And obviously, I would like to thank all our listeners for joining us on this episode today, as always. As you, if you're on the live stream, so do know that all the episodes can be found on all your favorite podcast apps or on YouTube. And if you do listen to that on these platforms, know that we do stream the episodes live on Twitch and YouTube Live, and also on X. So follow us on Twitter or X at OpenObserve to get the live stream times and to stay up to date on more deep dives like this one and so on. And as always, I'm Dotan Horvitz. If you have any feedback, you feel free to also reach out to me. I'll put on the notes for where to catch up with Kyle if you want to reach out to Kyle, or do you want to say it yourself where they can find you?
Yeah, I'm Linux underscore McLinux face on Mastodon at Fostodon. So we'll put it in the notes. It's a little bit of a mouthful.
Definitely. Yeah. It's already on the YouTube one, and we'll definitely put it on the rest of them. So do check it out as well, and follow Valkey, the project. With that, I'd like to thank you everyone for listening. See you on next month's episode, and as I always say, may the open source be with you.